At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Welcome back, it's good to have you with me. Get ready to meet the UK's first and only tree-hugging lawyer, Sarah Dodd, as I pick her brains in the aftermath of the Sycamore Gap trial, which she followed inch by inch in the hope of a revolution towards how trees are protected in the UK. I find out what, if anything, we have learnt from the whole ordeal, whether or not Sarah feels there's an adequate sense of justice and reconciliation that's been served, and what the last tree was that she hugged. These questions and more answered here in our thought-provoking chat. Welcome to the pod, Sarah. Now, I think you're probably joining us from Barry, right?
That's right, yeah, Barry Island.
Oh, nice. Well, that's a place I only know from Gavin and Stacey, but I'm sure Barry has a lot more to offer than just that basic pop culture reference, right?
Yeah, there are other things occurring, if I can use that as an expression.
Love that. How's your week going?
Yeah, not bad, thanks. It's been another busy one here at Tree Law. We're growing quite quickly at the moment. So, yeah, just working hard to keep up with all that our clients want us to do.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a lot of change and discussion happening in the sphere of trees and law, litigation, protection. And it felt like a really good time to just check in with you as someone kind of really leading in that subject. I'd love to get your reflections on where we are with that picture in the UK at the moment. But before that, can we start a little bit with your own personal journey with trees? And if I were to ask you, what do trees mean to you, what would you say?
That's a big question, isn't it? And do you know, I was asked that a lot when the Sycamore Gap trial started, like, why do people care so much about trees? And what do trees mean to me? I think one of my first memories around trees involves picking apples from my grandparents' apple tree with them. It meant a lot. It's a lovely, happy family memory. So I think that's probably where things started. And I think living in quite a rural community helped as well. You know, our landmarks when you were playing games as kids were trees. You know, there was a certain tree that we all used to play a game around, you know, so they were quite a focal element of my childhood.
Yeah, I actually had a little bit of time off. Obviously, my two girls are off for summer holidays and we were picking some plums the other day and they just absolutely loved it. You know, something about taking something straight from the tree, and then they actually made some ice lollies with it, along with some blackberries that we picked as well. But I think those are probably going to be memories that really stay with them. And that sounds like something similar to when you were picking those apples.
The apples were awful. Like, we couldn't ever eat them. But yeah, picking them was really fun.
And I guess what you're speaking to a little bit there is how trees leave a kind of memory in us. And I was going to save this question till later in our chat, but I can't help asking it now. My understanding of the world of law is that it's supposed to be a rational place that, in a sense, cuts through emotion. Yet the topic of trees, which is your specialism in that legal sphere, is full of emotion, and trees are really evocative, aren't they? So how does that juxtaposition work in your experience?
That's a great question. How does it work? I mean, and my thoughts might evolve as I'm sort of talking this through, but I think the starting point is the law is black or white. And throughout my career, I've heard people say, oh, lawyers very much like to work in black or white. And it struck me throughout my whole career how wrong that is. And lawyers aren't black or white. They're colourful. They work in the middle. They're creative. They can be black. They can be white. They can be all sorts of things. So I think there's space for the law to encompass all of that and to encompass emotion and to encompass things like trees, which they're a unique entity, aren't they? They're not easily described. It's not easy to put a value on them. I think there's a lot of change happening in this environmental space at the moment and has been happening over the last few years, where actually climate litigation is really developing. And I think that question about emotion and the value of things is a question that's been asked across the world for lots of different reasons. And I can't talk in tremendous amount of depth about that sort of thing, but I think it's something that we see in terms of Indigenous people, rivers, other ecosystems and environment. Trees are part of that. Not sure if that answer's very clear, but it's not a straightforward question.
No, I totally agree. I'm grateful for you leaning into that one. And as you say, I reckon throughout our chat, maybe it's something we might circle back to or cover in a bit more depth with some real examples. And reflecting on what you shared there, we obviously have what we understand to be the largest population of human beings on the planet at the moment. And I suppose that means that our societies have become pretty complex, and frameworks have been essential in sort of us being able to organise ourselves. But at the same time, we potentially have departed away from a place that might have had less kind of what we would regard maybe as intellectual kind of knowledge, and somewhere that would have been connecting with trees and nature through the heart and through direct experience and through storytelling. And it's interesting you mentioned that it feels like some of that's almost kind of surfacing in one way or another. And our current systems are kind of grappling with that a little bit.
I've done a couple of seminars and talks with environmental groups, which very much ask you to leave all your thoughts of the law at the door and come up, without any filters of possibility or anything, just come up with potential new solutions to difficult questions. Which when I first tried to do that, it was incredibly hard. But then once you get into the swing of it, it's very liberating because you can, come up with loads of different suggestions. And a big one that I've talked about, or I've heard other people talk about, is giving trees their own legal standing. So obviously at the moment, a tree can't bring a legal claim because it's a tree, doesn't have legal standing. So there are almost role-playing what it would look like if a tree were to be given legal standing in the UK and how that might look like in a court. I saw a video of a mock trial which was going ahead in a woodland with a barrister who deals with tree law cases being involved, and it was what it would look like if a tree were to have legal standing and sort of running it in a woodland environment.
That sounds really interesting. I'd love to see that. And since 2021, when you set up your company, Tree Law, you've also become the UK's official tree hugging lawyer. So what's that journey been like?
I think the journey of setting up any business, is a journey of ups and downs, which is the nicest way I can sum it up, I think. Setting up a law firm isn't for the faint-hearted at all. And I think going into setting up Tree Law, there's an element of blissful ignorance. Obviously, I'd never set up a law firm before, so I didn't know all the ins and outs of exactly what that was going to look like. But also, I was setting up something that didn't already exist. So a lot of it has been learning on the job, and that has felt scary and incredibly vulnerable at times, but then also massively rewarding and intellectually challenging and nourishing. I don't think I've had 4 years of such intense academic, emotional, personal learning. It's just been immense. So it's very difficult to sum up. If you asked me in October 21, the month before Tree Law launch, what's Tree Law going to look like? That would be incredibly different to what I now say Tree Law looks like. I don't think I could have dreamt of it looking like it does now. And I'm still experiencing that. So, when people say, what's your 5-year plan? What's it going to look like? I think now I can see what it's going to look like. But also I want to continue with the ability to say, I don't know to questions. Because I think the minute you say, I don't know, then everything is possible. Everything's still on the table.
Thanks, Sarah. I work for National Trust, and I've worked for them for around 15 years and with trees in one way or another. And currently I'm the main tree and woodland advisor for the southeast of England. And I can definitely relate to exactly what you said, that almost like the longer time goes on, the more confident I become in saying, actually, I don't know. A big part of my role sometimes is tactfully reminding others that they don't really know something, and that we are often resting on assumptions. And that can be quite liberating when you do that. It doesn't always make things easy when you do need to find a solution for certain problems or make a decision. But I can definitely relate to that open-endedness you describe. And does that feel like the biggest difference of how you thought it might be at the start versus how it actually is working in tree law?
Yeah, and also, growing that confidence in myself to think, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the solution, but also I don't know anybody else that would know the answer or the solution to that. So let's start chipping away and work out what the answer and the solution is and not feel that sort of crushing, oh my goodness, I don't know, I should know. Oh, so yeah.
I wonder if you could just list the top 3 things in terms of the inquiries that land on your desk in terms of trees and law. What are the top 3 categories that those issues fit into?
Tree preservation orders for sure. And you can split that into planning issues and damage caused by tree preservation order protected trees and criminal issues of trees. Neighbour disputes around trees, light, birds pooing, leaves, that really frustrating. And then I do have a big background in dealing with trees where they've caused subsidence damage and subsidence linked to climate change. So I would say those 3.
Yeah, and I think the scale of the issues we're facing into are vast as well. I think the same with climate change, we can come up with guides that help with our decision making, but nobody has a crystal ball. And when you start to get local or specific or looking at the niche factors of any one situation, it's very difficult to apply broad brush kind of ways of guiding decision making. What is helpful though, isn't it, is case studies. And I think that takes us really nicely to the global news story that hit kind of 2 years into your business being still in its early stages. The now iconic Sycamore Gap tree was felled in late September 2023. And I'm going to hand to you because I'm sure you've followed that story very closely. But talk us through the events of that one in your own words.
I'm sure lots of people know what happened. Late September, middle of the night, 2 individuals, trained tree surgeons, took part in a 3-hour round trip from their home to the Sycamore Gap, lugging a load of equipment with them, and illegally felled the Sycamore Gap tree. They did it under the cover of darkness during a storm event. I don't know whether that was to make sure the roads were quiet or whatnot, but that's when it happened. It was the first tree crime where I observed that the police got involved. The police cordoned off the area with crime scene tape. Forensic experts turned up. There was a huge police investigation launched, an enormous amount of evidence gathered, lots of witnesses taken, and these 2 individuals were prosecuted for 2 charges each, which was criminal damage to the Sycamore Gap tree and to Hadrian's Wall, because the tree fell onto the wall and damaged that. That then went to a criminal trial in April of this year in Newcastle Crown Court. Both defendants pleaded not guilty. There was a jury trial before the Crown Court. There was global press attention for that jury trial. I went up to Newcastle for day 1 and it was a packed house. I was going to say standing room only in the court, but they don't let you stand. So, the equivalent of standing room only. With press from across the world there, I spoke to national press, but also press in New York, Las Vegas. It got global attention. The BBC did some great coverage from within the courtroom as the evidence was being given by the witnesses. One of the starkest pieces, in my opinion, was when they played a WhatsApp video in the courtroom, which was a grainy nighttime WhatsApp quality video of the tree being felled. You could see the tree almost like in the moonlight. I know that sounds a bit romantic, but then you could hear the chainsaw was so loud, and that must have just been echoing around the courtroom. But I think the actual act itself was like done and dusted in a couple of minutes. They found that WhatsApp video on one of the defendants' phones. They played that. You couldn't see who was doing it in the video because it was such poor quality. But I think that was the key piece of evidence in the trial. We didn't really get an idea of why the defendants did it. And when they were saying they didn't do it, they said they were not guilty. They said that although the police evidence, pinging of their phones across cell site towers and AMPR with the cars, they said, okay, we admit that the car went there and we admit that the phone went there, but we don't admit we were with the car and the phone. It sounds strange, doesn't it, as an argument? Yeah, so that's the defense that they raised. And one of them said in the witness box, who doesn't know what all the fuss is about, it was just a tree. So there was that sort of just a tree quote that again ricocheted around the press a little bit. When the evidence was finished and the jury was sent out to retire and consider their verdict, I think they were sent out 3:00 or something one afternoon, and they'd come back with their verdict by first thing the next morning, the guilty verdict. And then there was a good couple of months then between early May and the middle of July when the sentencing went ahead. And I went back up to Newcastle then for the sentencing hearing to see what the judge was going to do in terms of sentencing them. Again, an enormous amount of press attention. It felt like different press attention this time. I spoke to the French press, I spoke to Canadian press. But in terms of the sentencing, the press had made an application to the judge for permission to televise the sentencing remarks. So this was actually going to be the 35th televising of a Crown Court sentencing. So it's not 10 a penny. When it got to the part where she delivered her sentencing judgment, the outcome of that, I don't know whether you've got particular questions about that, was that they were both given a custodial sentence. So that, again, was another big question, whether they were going to get a custodial sentence as a result of being found guilty.
Yeah, so in terms of precedent set, this was a really unique case, and I suppose we're still working out the full influence and impact of it on wider tree issues and conversation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I don't think it sets a precedent in the truest sense of the word of precedent, but yes, it's the first case of this type where a custodial sentence has been given. It's raised lots of questions, lots of discussions about trees, the value of old trees, how we protect old trees, the importance of trees, how the law deals with that. I went along to the sentencing hearing as a lawyer thinking, I may well hear things in this judgment that mean when I return to my office, I need to change the advice that I've given on a couple of my cases. So I was primed and ready for change. Yeah, there wasn't any in that sense.
Yeah, and to give my own perspective on tree law and tree protection as it stands, I end up reconfessing this every episode near enough, but yeah, it's pretty obvious that I am really into ancient and veteran trees in particular, and I do what I can to advocate for their protection, and it is kind of wafer thin, actually, in reality. I think what's written down on the government web pages about veteran trees, it couldn't be better. They're described as irreplaceable. You cannot get better than that. Obviously, that is not statute law. And then when you kind of look at how that plays out in the real world, actually, trees are being affected every day with no repercussions. And this conversation about Sycamore Gap, again, really curious that actually that sycamore tree, as iconic as it was in that landscape, between those two really picturesque hills and pretty much the only tree around for miles around, it kind of symbolized something else, didn't it, to people? The tree itself, not that old, but it's prompted people to consider the role of trees in the longer term, which I think's a really positive thing. But still, we're quite away from actually delivering the level of protection I feel like our oldest trees, or actually just trees in general, deserve, and the respect that they deserve in our world. But it's not a bad thing that it's kind of opened that can of worms to get people talking about it. And I think for me, it almost feels like if tree protection orders and that kind of irreplaceable factor around ancient and veteran trees were actually applied better and with more integrity, actually, the systems are already there. They're just not being used fully. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts are going through my head then. Like, I was asked a lot about whether I thought any sort of protection order could have prevented this from happening. But I don't think so. There could have been all sorts of protection in place in terms of the Sycamore Gap tree, and it would have made no difference. At the end of the sentencing hearing, I came out feeling a little bit like the tree was lost in the outcome. The tree felt like it was valued because of its location, because it was a landmark, because of people's feelings about it, because of people's experiences around it. It's very nuanced and it's almost difficult for me to put into words, but it was all about the people and why the people were upset that it went, rather than about it as an inherent thing of value in itself. I think it could have been a beautiful painting or a statue or a landmark from a war years ago. It could have been any of those things. Its value as a tree, I felt at the last minute just fell under the radar. And that made me feel quite flat coming out of that. I felt like sort of like a legal opportunity was missed, but I also just felt like there were no winners really at the end. And I think I'm still reflecting on that.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, you've left me with quite a few thoughts there, actually. A few quick ones in following up on what you've shared in the last few minutes. How, in your mind, do you kind of reconcile what those two guys did? Like, you said there wasn't really a sense in the room of why they did that. Can you get your head around that? Or is it just like, we really just don't know?
I think it was for attention, because I think the back and forth on the WhatsApp messages that came out in evidence, the following day it was like, look, it's getting loads of press attention. The press are picking this up, or this is going viral. There were comments like that, which imply that it was done for attention. But I think without quite realizing the level of attention that it would get, and the fact that that meant the police would take it seriously.
Yeah. And the other main thing you were describing there was that feeling that left you flat, that actually it was more like the cultural, people-centered significance of the tree, which really came through as the main factor discussed. Now, I met with someone from Forestry Commission last week, Forestry Commission's National Enforcement Manager. His name was Darryl. He'd been quite close to the case at Sycamore Gap as well. And he actually said to me that the tree was valued at around £458,000, which I think must be the most expensive tree in history. Is that right?
No, I think I think that was using the CAVAT valuation system, and there have been trees valued at over £1 million using CAVAT. And this is where there was a lot of discussion around tree valuation, how to put a money value on the tree. Is there any good way to put a financial value on a tree? There was a lot of discussion around that. And that was the bit that I was almost looking to see if there were going to be any judicial comments on. CAVAT as a valuation system is built to value amenity trees in the urban environment. So you are round peg and square holing it, trying to use something, a tool like that for something like the Sycamore Gap. And I'm not being critical of that at all, because there just simply isn't a tool out there that fits neatly into this sort of scenario. I think initially the figures being talked about were about 620. I think that then came down to 450. And then on the day of the sentencing hearing, there was some talk about agreement between the two sides that it was sort of 200,000. But again, and not being disparaging in any way, shape or form, but I don't think there were any people in the legal representation teams of either party that deal in these sorts of cases day in, day out. They are, criminal advocates. And I think no one really has a huge amount of experience in dealing with these sorts of things. So that's what I was looking to see. What is the judge going to say about the value of the tree? But at the hearing, the sentencing hearing, the comment that she made was the tool wasn't apt. All I know and all I needed to know was that the value of the damage was worth more than £5,000. Therefore, it's taken me into the next bracket of severity. And then off she went from there. that was all that was said about that.
So I just assumed that that would be the most expensive single tree ever when I posed that question. But you just said to me that actually there's been some trees worth $1 million. Which ones are they? And what are the factors that tip them into that kind of stratosphere?
So I think Calvat got launched in about 2007, 2008. And even then, using the Calvat tool to value some large street trees in certain parts of London were coming out with values over £1 million, because it is about valuing an amenity tree in an urban landscape. And the sort of multipliers within the calculator include things like the number of people that see that tree on a day-by-day basis, the size of the tree, its likely lifespan, the sort of fullness of the canopy, and a sort of a multiplier for the actual area that it is in the UK. So you can imagine a scenario in which a tree is in a very wealthy area of London with a very high footfall, very healthy, and with a long life ahead of it, is going to come out with quite a high figure. You're not comparing like with like then when you're thinking, well, why might a London plane tree in Kensington have a higher value on it than the Sycamore Gap in a UNESCO World Heritage Site? There is no answer to that, is there?
There isn't. No. Such interesting questions there raised, because coming back to one of the very first answers you gave about a identity being given potentially to trees in a trial, or a river, as we've heard talked about recently. I think there's at least one river in the UK that does have its own identity, and that linked to perhaps ways that we would have used to view what we describe as natural resources, I guess. There's an ethos around protecting these things for their own sake as well as ours. But actually, the examples and the case study we've just dived right into there speaks of a system that is saying that unless loads of people are around it, and particularly those that are well endowed, then actually, the financial value is never going to be that big. I wonder what you think the most valuable tree in Barry might be.
In Barry?
Yeah.
I don't know. Actually, do you know, I live in an area of South Wales which has got the lowest canopy cover, I think. And it's just made me reflect how, and I don't want to get sort of too right on about this, but how we just put ourselves at the heart of everything, don't we? Like the arrogance of that feels enormous, doesn't it? You know, when you're just saying about natural resources, then you think, yeah, so we're considering a tree a resource. So we're only considering it to have a value because of what it can do for us. Who are we to say that? Like a tree can live for hundreds of years and we're just like a fleeting moment in time in a tree's existence. I think that was one of the points which, when I was asked a lot, why do Brits love trees, which is a question the American press loved. And I put it on my LinkedIn just to try and ask some of my connections, like, what do you think? Because I'm coming up with some suggestions, but what do you think? And I got so many different answers back. Like, I actually downloaded them all and put them into ChatGPT and said, can you like categorize these? And it came up with like 8 categories. And I think one of them was that they are almost like our elders. They survive generations. They are, you know, a steady and constant presence. And we sort of come along within that steady and constant presence and call them a resource. Shame on us. That's a bit right on, but you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, I think I continue to look into this kind of subject. It really does intrigue me. One of the things I've learned recently is if you look at the definition of a tree, it's very much describing it as an object. You know, look in Oxford or Cambridge dictionary, a tree is a plant with a woody stem. Pretty much end of right there. And yet, actually, I've managed to make getting near to 40 episodes of a podcast about many other different kind of significances of these organisms. If you look a little bit further back, one theory is that the word tree actually came from a Sanskrit root, which was much more closely aligned with truth and trust. So that's a whole different concept. But I think that change in language probably mirrors a wider cultural change that we've undergone over the last few centuries, actually. But yeah, turning back to the Sycamore Gap tree and the impact that had on the general public, That for me in my career with trees was like nothing else in terms of how it stirred emotion and a response from people, even if they perhaps didn't quite have the language to describe what it made them feel. What was your observation on that part of the Sycamore Gap story?
I think it was something that everybody had heard about, which was really unusual for me working in law around trees. I can't go into the pub and have a conversation about the sorts of cases I'm dealing with. People like nod off. But yeah, you could go into the pub and say, have you heard of the Sycamore Gap? What's your thoughts? What do you think? And people have heard about it. So as horrendous as it was, I feel like it has elevated the profile of the law around trees and tree cases, tree protection, treating that all a lot more seriously. So a couple of people, one local YouTuber to Newcastle that I follow called Eddie, he's great. I've been watching his videos and I met him at the trial. And he likened waking up in the morning the day after the Sycamore Gap had been felled to the morning he woke up after we had the news that Princess Diana had died. That sort of stopped you in your tracks. You weren't quite sure that you were going to care that much, but all of a sudden you're absolutely dumbfounded and emotionally connected to something you didn't know you even thought about. There was a lot of that, a lot of outrage. And I think during the trial, there was a lot of talk about the value of trees, protecting them, doing more, that sort of thing. Why we love trees so much, why they mean so much to us. And then I observed a shift in the question and the points that are being raised then at the sentencing hearing. So on the morning of the sentencing hearing, I was on Nikki Campbell's Radio 5 talk show. Really interesting. I think it was only meant to go on for half an hour and the conversation was going so well. We went on for an hour. And it was really interesting conversations involving a barrister, me, someone from the Woodland Trust, a couple of members of the public, talking about what should happen in terms of a sentencing, how severely these individuals should be punished for felling a tree. And that led to lots of interesting questions. The shock of what they'd done and being found guilty was sort of put to one side. And then it was a question of crime and punishment question of what is the purpose of a custodial sentence? A potential 10-year sentence was an absolute maximum they could get. So the question was, wouldn't that be ridiculous given two individuals a 10-year prison sentence when somebody involved in an accidental death can be out of prison in 6 months? Where's the justice in that? That was the first time I felt that as a crime was being compared with other crimes. And actually, what is the point of punishment? Is it to punish? Is it to rehabilitate? Is it to deter others? Somebody said, well, they should train up as tree surgeons and learn about trees. And, we flagged up they were already tree surgeons. And I still don't know what my opinion is about, I think they had a 4 years, 3-month sentence. I think with the order that they weren't to serve more than 40% of that. I think one of them had already been in custody, so that amount of custody was going to be knocked off. So I think probably they'll end up being in prison for a year and a half. But it really started to make me think. At the sentencing hearing, you hear a lot about the background of the individuals. We heard a lot about the mental health of one of them, about the very difficult childhood he had, just his difficulties. And it just made me feel a sense of empathy towards him and his vulnerabilities. And then, sad for the tree, just sad for everybody concerned, sad for all the money that was spent in pursuing a prosecution. I mean, it sat there in the courtroom, there must have been 10 people on the legal teams across all three parties. I mean, the legal profession's expensive. You think that's in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. There's just sadness all over. So I was left feeling like that.
Yeah, it's kind of almost that witch hunt kind of culture playing out, isn't it? And then actually the verdict's delivered, but no one really feels ultimately that satisfied when actually the same issue could happen tomorrow quite easily. And there are many factors behind that. Thanks, Sarah, because I think you've brought a human aspect to this conversation there in terms of considering that incident. Appreciate that.
Is someone else going to look at that and think, oof, the risk is a 4 year, 3-month prison sentence? I'm not going to do what I was going to plan to do because it's just too risky. Criminal acts are going to happen, aren't they? It needs action way before that. Like if you were to think, what's our most effective way of preserving, protecting amenity trees? Yes, putting greater protection on them is going to help. Obviously, sentencing is going to be a deterrent. But surely the thing that's going to help the most, and I'm sure this is probably across other crimes as well, is going back to the absolute basics, and instilling in everybody the value of our environment from a really early stage so that you grow up with an appreciation of it. Now, there's absolutely no easy way to do that, is there? I know a load of people get really involved and do brilliant work with schools and young people to try and help them appreciate and enjoy the natural environment. But I think perhaps that's where we start, isn't it? As well as, bigger sanctions. But I think it's got to be something that we appreciate as individuals, which I know is going to be a hard sell if you're saying that to somebody who might live in, I don't know, Tower Hamlets and might not have a tree anywhere nearby or green space that they can go and enjoy. But I think where that's possible, that really has to be encouraged.
Do you mind me asking how trees make you feel personally?
I would say calm. In my past, before I started a business and had to spend 24 hours a day working on my business, I was a runner and did lots of trail running. I used to be able to run from my house, not very far, and I'd be straight into a nature reserve. And I could just feel myself as I ran into the nature reserve with all the trees around me. It's just a peace which I don't think I could experience anywhere else. And sometimes I forget that. And then I remind myself when I go and walk around an area with lots of trees. So I would say that, yeah, calm. And also relatively insignificant, which perhaps is something that feeds into the calmness because you realise you're just a tiny speck in a whole great big universe.
So we're getting towards the end of the interview now, and there's a question I absolutely can't not ask. But what was the last tree you hugged?
The last tree I hugged, I think it was a plane tree in the street in Barry, and took a photo of myself doing it. Yeah, so that one. What about you?
So I've been really lucky the last few months to have quite a few opportunities to go and visit quite a few ancient tree sites through the podcast in places, just meeting people. I've been to Savernake Forest, Petworth. Last week I was at Cowdrey Park, and there's some incredible ancient trees there. I spoke about this a little bit when I met with Julian Height, the heritage tree specialist and storyteller. And we were saying how actually with some of those really old trees, we almost feel a tentativeness to get too close to them. And they're so awe-inspiring that I've been approaching those a bit more gingerly. But in terms of hugging them, yeah, I don't know. I do find myself kind of placing my hand on a tree now and again. And in terms of the trees that look after me, I suppose there's one literally right outside my front door. It's like a shared crabapple tree that's just absolutely full of crabapples right now. My kids climb up that tree and it's just there. You just subtly notice it through the seasons kind of changing. And that's one I should go and give a big hug to for all that it quietly gives to my life. So yeah, I might have to do that later today.
I'll often do that, just put my hand up against it. And again, people are going to think I've sounded quite woo-woo, I bet. But you can almost feel that energy and that connection. You think, I wonder if you can feel me, because I can feel your sort of steady presence. I'm sure it can. I mean, let's open our mind. I don't mean to sound like I'm on a psychedelic, but, it's an energy thing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And you're definitely not the first person to mention that kind of experience. So yeah. Maybe it's something we don't understand, but there must be something there. And perhaps more than that, it speaks to a gratitude as well. So when I place my hand on a tree, I'm thinking in my mind, thank you to that tree, for that experience it's giving me or just kind of being there. Mm. Wow, what a wide-ranging conversation we've had. Thanks so much for all that you've shared this morning, Sarah. I think our listeners are going to love this episode. And I just want to hand to you for a final message to sign us off.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. It's always been quite an emotional discussion. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. I feel like I've been on a forest bathing session. But yeah, thanks to everybody that's listened. And if you want to hear more from me, I've got a free training seminar coming up on the 9th of September. So if you want to click on my website, treelaw.co.uk, we've got free tickets to attend a Zoom-based seminar. So if you want to hear more about tree protection and the law around that, then sign up.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, leave a comment and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And see you next time.